It took me 20 years to realize that it wasn't my wife who was ruining my sex life. It was me. Anne and I have been married for more than 2 decades. During that time, we've raised children together, weathered countless ups and downs, and have generally been a happy couple. But if there's one area of our relationship that has always felt unfulfilled, it's our sex life. I've always felt like our sex life needed to be different. Something fresher, more daring, or at least more exciting than it is now. I'm not saying our sex life is bad. On the contrary, we've always had a strong attraction to each other. But I'm the one with the higher libido, and I feel unsatisfied if things are just okay. Anne is different. She is not indifferent to sex. She still enjoys it and initiates it, but she is not obsessed with doing it differently or constantly upgrading it. For Anne, connection, tenderness, and a sense of security are the core. I crave a sense of breakthrough, surprise, even a little adventure. And it is this gap of expectations that has become a simmering point of friction between us for many years. We have sat down and talked frankly many times, about desires, about limits, about differences. But the more we talked, the more serious it became, like a problem that needed to be resolved completely, not a natural intimacy between two lovers. Gradually, instead of being a joy, sex became a stressful, heavy topic, even making both of us feel pressured. What I didn't realize at the time was that my attempts to change my sex life were actually undermining the intimacy I wanted. I didn't see that Anne had always been there, just in her own way, gently and consistently. And I, in my desire for more and better, had inadvertently made her withdraw. If I could go back in time, the only thing I would say to my younger self would be, "Stop. Don't try to force anything. Happiness doesn't come from trying to do things differently. It comes from appreciating what you already have." I don't know exactly when the shift in my thinking began to take shape. Maybe it was after another argument that went nowhere, or after an evening when I felt inadequate despite trying to prepare for a romantic night. But it was certainly the result of many years of self-reflection and a gradual realization. I wasn't sexually deprived. I was gratefully deprived. When you're constantly looking at what you don't have, even if your life is filled with love, intimacy, and connection, you still feel empty. I was so focused on comparing, fantasizing, expecting, that I lost sight of the beauty in Anne's simplicity. She wasn't someone who would randomly put on a mask, tie me to the bed, or send provocative texts in the middle of work, which, to be honest, I had hoped for. But she was always the one who initiated the act of stroking my hair when I was tired, hugging me for long periods of time without any reason, and expressing her desires in her own way. I just didn't really pay attention. I also began to realize that constantly trying to improve our sex life wasn't making it better. It was unintentionally putting more burdens on my wife. I didn't realize that every time I talked about how to make it better, I was implicitly telling her, "It's not good enough now." I thought I was encouraging, inspiring, but in reality I was subtly and constantly hurting her. Instead of making her want to explore, I made her feel judged. Every time we got intimate, it was no longer just a moment of intimacy, but also a test to see if this time would meet my expectations. And I realized, if I were in that position, I would have withdrawn too. So, about 6 months ago, I set myself a challenge. Stop trying to improve my sex life. It sounds counterintuitive, but it was the best thing I ever did. I stopped asking, "How can I be better?" and started asking, "How can I be more present?" I started focusing on connection instead of performance. I learned to enjoy every touch, every hug, every moment of intimacy without expecting what would come next. I also started practicing active gratitude. Every time Anne touched me, even if it was just a caress, I acknowledged it. not verbally but emotionally. I let myself truly feel she chose me, and in doing so I began to see her differently, not because she had changed, but because my perspective had changed. And magically, when I stopped looking for newness, it began to appear on its own. Anne gradually became more comfortable. She no longer felt the need to do it right or do it enough. She began to take initiative in a way I had never seen before. Not because I asked her to, but because she wanted it. And I realized that the better I had been pursuing for so long had always been there. I just hadn't been patient and sensitive enough to see it. This change not only deepened our sex life, but also renewed the way we communicated, the way I looked at her, and the way I loved myself. I was no longer the man who was always hungry for sexual affirmation, but became someone who could be at peace with simple but meaningful intimacy. And perhaps the most beautiful thing I realized was, when you love someone without demanding better, they naturally become wonderful. I think the most surprising thing about this whole journey wasn't my change. It was Anne's change. And what confused me, in a good way, was that she didn't change because of me, but because I stopped trying to change her. Without the invisible pressure of my expectations, Anne was able to remove the armor she had been wearing to protect herself. And as soon as I stopped pushing, she began to express herself in a surprising way, in the most natural, lovely, and sexy way I've ever seen her. I still remember the confusion, joy, and a little panic when Anne first walked into the bathroom with a big smile on her face, stripped of all her defenses and clothes. There was no preamble, no right setting, just a pure moment of initiative. She smiled like a girl in love, came up to me and said, "I think it's a beautiful day." It was beautiful. I walked around the house all day like I had just won the lottery. Then another evening, when the kids were out, I walked into her room and found her lying on the bed, wearing only 2 socks. One wrapped around her chest, the other between her legs. She looked at me, pointed, and said, "You never put those socks away, now they're props." I almost fell over laughing, but you know what? It was one of the sexiest moments I've ever experienced. Not because of the creative outfit, but because of her playfulness, initiative, and ease. The woman I'd loved for 20 years, now making my heart beat like it did in the beginning. Anne started to take the initiative in the most unexpected moments. Once, while I was meditating in the living room, she came over, sat on my lap, took off my shirt, and said, "We have 20 minutes before the kids come home." I have an idea. And I, the man who used to run around looking for stimulation, could only nod obediently like a student whose roll was unexpectedly called. Another time, after I had massaged her feet all evening, she didn't just say "thank you" and go to sleep as usual. Instead, she took me by the hand and led me into the bedroom, told me to sit on the edge of the bed. Then, without saying anything else, she knelt down in front of me, gently undressed me, and I'll stop here to preserve some privacy and let you imagine the rest as you see fit. Just know that everything that followed was filled with tenderness, connection, and unexpected joy. What touched me most was not the boldness of her actions, but the ease with which she was with me. No more reservations, no more worries about whether she was sexy enough or the right type for me. She was herself, and that was the sexiest thing in the world. I look back on all of this and realize the magic happens when you create a safe space for your partner to be themselves. No strategy, no advice from How to Make Your Marriage Work books. Just love them the way they are, and they will surprise you in ways you never expected. It took me nearly 2 decades to understand that sex is not a problem to be solved, but a song to be listened to. After all those years of struggling with expectations, comparisons, longings, and disappointments, What I learned didn't come from a book or a marriage counselor. It came from silence, from the moment I stopped asking, "Why not?" and started asking, "Why?" When I stopped and really listened, not to the words, but to the feelings, to the energy between us, I began to understand a simple truth. Sex isn't a structure to be built, but a flow to be flowed with. The biggest lesson I learned is that more isn't always better. Sometimes less, but deeper, warmer, is exactly what we need. It's true that I craved change, passion, variety, but where I went wrong was in making it a personal project, rather than a journey of companionship. I didn't let Anne be part of that dream. I just dragged her along, hoping she would change to satisfy what I thought was right. I also learned that satisfaction doesn't come from the other person, but from how we see them. As I stopped demanding that Anne be someone else, she showed me more of who she really was. A woman who was gentle, delicate, sometimes spontaneous, and always deeply emotional. She didn't change her nature, but because I changed the way I saw her, she became more radiant in my eyes than ever. I used to think that frequent, bold, or novel lovemaking was the measure of a happy marriage. Now, I understand that a conscious touch, a loving gaze, or an aimless kiss can be more profound than a night of passion. Because what truly connects us is not the act of sex, but the feeling of being seen, accepted, and loved. And in the end, I realized I had been my own biggest obstacle. I was the one who put pressure on myself, pushed myself into a state of dissatisfaction, and inadvertently put my wife on the defensive. When I removed that pressure, not just on her but on myself, our relationship began to blossom again, in a way that was gentle, natural, and more precious than ever. This is not just a story about sex. It is a story about letting go in order to truly connect, about learning to love your partner unconditionally, and trusting that love, if left to grow, will always find its way to bloom in its most beautiful way. If you are a young husband, let me say this, not as advice, but as a whisper from someone who has been through the tough times of marriage. You don't have to be the perfect husband. Don't try to be the bedroom expert, the passionate lover, the one who plans surprises every week. What your woman needs, sometimes very simply, is to feel safe, to be herself without fear of being judged, compared, or having to follow some standard you secretly set. I used to be the one who always asked, "Why don't we do it more often? Why isn't she as proactive as this person or that person? Does she still find me attractive?" And the more I asked, the more distant I felt. The more I searched for what I lack, the less I could see what I have. If I could go back in time and meet my newlywed self, I would sit down, look him in the eye, and say, "Stop, breathe. She's not a project to be improved. She's a woman, learning to love in her own way, with her vulnerabilities, her hesitations, her unspoken desires. Your job is not to bring it up, but to welcome it when it comes. Sex, no matter how many books you read, how many how-to videos you watch, how many new techniques you try, is ultimately just an extension of your emotional connection. If you listen to your wife every day with genuine interest, if you hold her for the sake of holding her, not to suggest her, if you look at her as if she's a miracle you can never fully possess, I bet you'll see amazing things happen. Not right away, not the wow kind like in the movies, but the quiet, sweet kind that makes you feel lucky to grow old with that person. Marriage is not a race, it's a climb, sometimes hard, sometimes foggy. But if you go long enough with enough patience and love, one day you'll stand at the top and look back with a satisfied smile. We didn't give up. Be patient, be kind, listen. And most of all, be grateful, not when everything is perfect, but in the moments when it seems boring, monotonous, lacking in fire. Because from there, if you care enough, love can flare up in ways you never expected.